My parents laughed when my sister called me a failure. They thought I would always be the struggling one, the one they could dismiss at the dinner table. But the day her millionaire husband stood up for me changed everything. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember that evening as if it were yesterday. The sharp clinking of silverware against porcelain, the soft hum of the chandelier above, and the scent of roasted chicken that should have made the gathering feel warm and inviting. Instead, it felt like I was sitting in the middle of a courtroom where I was both the defendant and the punchline. The room was filled with laughter, but it wasn't the kind that draws you in or makes you feel included. It was the kind that cuts directed squarely at me. My sister, elegant as always in her designer dress, had leaned back in her chair, smirking as she delivered the line that silenced me. Honestly, you're such a failure. I don't even know how you live with yourself. The words hung in the air like smoke after a firework, impossible to ignore. My first instinct was to look toward my parents, silently pleading for the comfort of their disapproval toward her cruelty. Surely, they wouldn't allow such an insult at the dinner table. Surely, they would at least offer me a shred of dignity. But what came instead was laughter. My father chuckled, shaking his head as if my sister had said something clever. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, stifling her giggles but failing miserably. Their eyes met across the table, sharing the kind of look that said, "Isn't she witty?" It was a sound that tore through me in a way I can hardly describe. That moment stripped away any illusion I had left that maybe, deep down, they still respected me despite my different path in life. I realized in an instant that to them, my sister's cruel words were not cruel at all. They were simply true. I sat there frozen, my fork hovering over my plate, the chicken now tasteless in my mouth. Heat rose to my cheeks, not from embarrassment alone, but from the raw betrayal of the two people who should have been my protectors. I didn't lash out. I didn't shout or argue. Instead, I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, letting the pattern of embroidered flowers blur as I blinked back the sting in my vision. A calm mask settled over me, the kind you put on when you know showing your pain will only make them laugh harder. Inside, though, something had shifted. Their laughter wasn't just a reaction, it was a declaration. A line had been crossed, and I knew then that nothing would ever be the same between us again. That dinner table, with its polished cutlery and crystal glasses, had become the stage for my humiliation. And it was there, in that very moment, that the story I'm about to share truly began. After that evening, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the sound of my parents' laughter, the smug look on my sister's face, the silence I swallowed like a bitter pill. But to really understand why it hurt so deeply, I need to tell you about who we all were, and what life in my family had always been like. I grew up in a household where comparison was as common as the morning coffee. From the earliest days, it was clear. My sister was the star. She was the golden child, the one my parents loved to parade in front of friends and relatives. If she brought home a drawing from kindergarten, it was framed and displayed proudly on the fridge. If I brought home one, it was politely admired before being tucked away in a drawer. My sister, let's call her Melissa, was only 2 years younger than me, but the gap in how we were treated might as well have been a canyon. She had an easy charm, a way of lighting up a room that my parents adored. She excelled in school, not necessarily because she was smarter than me, but because she had this knack for knowing exactly what teachers and adults wanted to hear. And she gave it to them, effortlessly. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more thoughtful. I didn't chase applause. I wanted to create a life that felt authentic to me, even if it didn't fit neatly into the boxes my parents imagined. In their eyes, that made me difficult, unambitious, a disappointment. By the time we reached adulthood, the contrast between us had only grown sharper. Melissa married young into money. Her husband was successful, a man who had built a thriving business and enjoyed the lifestyle that came with it. Overnight, she stepped into a world of luxury, sprawling homes, weekend getaways, designer handbags. My parents couldn't stop gushing about how lucky she was, as if her good fortune was proof that she had done life the right way. Meanwhile, I was carving out a different path. I wasn't rolling in wealth, but I had chosen independence. I worked hard, sometimes late nights, sometimes juggling multiple projects just to keep the bills paid. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was mine. Every small success felt earned, and I valued that. But to my parents, effort didn't matter. They measured worth by material success, and in their eyes, I had little to show for mine. They didn't understand the pride I took in standing on my own feet. All they saw was the absence of glitter, the lack of headlines they could brag about at family gatherings. That it was in those gatherings, especially, that the imbalance became obvious. My sister's achievements, real or embellished, were celebrated endlessly. She had a new car? My parents would gush about it for months. She hosted a dinner party? They'd call her such a gracious hostess. And me? If I mentioned a new project or a milestone I had reached, it was brushed aside, usually followed by, "That's nice, dear. But when are you going to settle down properly?" And the truth is, I wanted their approval, not in the way Melissa craved attention, but in the way every child longs for their parents to see them, to really see them, and say, "We're proud of you." I carried that quiet hope for years, even when their favoritism was plain. That's why the laughter at the dinner table cut so deeply. It wasn't just about being called a failure, it was the culmination of years of being overlooked, diminished, and measured against someone else's standards. Looking back, I realized the signs had always been there. The first warning bells weren't the insults themselves, but the silences that followed. The way my parents never spoke up when Melissa put me down. The way they seemed to encourage her superiority without ever saying the words outright. It was subtle at first, then sharper, and by the time of that dinner, it had grown into something impossible to ignore. And that was my normal world. A family dynamic built on favoritism, comparisons, and quiet betrayals. A world where Melissa's shine blinded my parents so completely that they never noticed how their other daughter was dimming right in front of them. But of course, everything shifted the night Melissa decided to take her cruelty one step further. The dinner that night started like so many others before it. Predictable, polished, and just a little suffocating. My parents had insisted on hosting, as they always did, because their dining room was their stage. They loved the ritual, the carefully set table with its gleaming silver cutlery, the fine china reserved for special occasions, and the polished conversation that made them feel like the perfect family. I came prepared, as I often did, to endure the subtle digs and constant comparisons. I told myself I would stay calm, that I wouldn't let Melissa's smugness get under my skin. After all, I had grown used to it over the years. But that night, the mask of civility slipped in a way I hadn't anticipated. The evening had been a parade of Melissa's triumphs. She talked at length about her latest shopping trip in Paris, the designer pieces she had brought back, and how exhausting it had been to fly first class when she really should have booked a private jet. My parents listened with wide-eyed admiration, nodding at every word. I stayed quiet, pushing the food around my plate, waiting for the storm to pass. And then, as though she had been saving it for the perfect moment, Melissa turned to me. Her smile was sharp, the kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes. "You know," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "I really don't understand how you live like this. You're in your 30s, and what do you have to show for it? No house, no husband, no real career. Honestly, you're such a failure. I don't even know how you live with yourself." There it was. The words I had always feared, she thought, spoken aloud for everyone to hear. My breath caught in my chest. I wanted to believe anyone would intervene. That my parents would finally defend me, tell her she was out of line. But instead, I heard it. That sound I can still hear echoing in my memory. Laughter. My father chuckled like Melissa had just delivered the punchline of a clever joke. My mother covered her mouth with her napkin, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain her amusement. They weren't embarrassed by what Melissa had said. They weren't horrified. They agreed. I felt the heat creep up my neck, the sting behind my eyes threatening to betray me. I fixed my gaze on the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered flowers as if they could anchor me. My fork slipped from my fingers, clattering softly against the plate, but no one noticed. They were too busy laughing at my expense. That was the moment. That was the line. It wasn't just Melissa anymore, it was my parents too. They had joined her. They had made her cruelty their own. And in that instant, I realized the truth. My family wasn't just indifferent to me. They were complicit in my humiliation. Something hardened inside me that night. A quiet voice whispered that enough was enough. I didn't know yet what I would do, or how I would reclaim my dignity. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again sit silently while they tore me apart. That dinner table became the battlefield. And Melissa, with her smug words and my parents' laughter behind her, had drawn first blood. Asterisk after that dinner, I thought perhaps Melissa had gotten what she wanted, her little jab, her moment of superiority, the laughter of our parents to cement her victory. I told myself she would leave it at that. But Melissa never left things at that. Once she saw that she could wound me and gain applause for it, she only sharpened her claws further. The weeks that followed were filled with small but deliberate humiliations. At family gatherings, Melissa seemed to make it her mission to highlight my shortcomings. She would sigh dramatically if I mentioned work, rolling her eyes and saying things like, "Oh, you're still doing that. When are you going to get a real career?" If I brought a dish to a dinner, she'd make a point of saying, "It's nice, but maybe next time just bring wine. Cooking seems not really your thing." It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it, always with that saccharine smile, as though she were being helpful, not cruel. And my parents? They enabled it. Every single time. They laughed, or nodded, or offered some half-hearted comment that only fueled her. One evening in particular stands out. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, sipping tea. My father asked Melissa about her husband's latest business venture, and she launched into a story about how much money they were making. At some point, she glanced at me with a glint in her eye and said, "Maybe we should hire you to help clean the office. At least then you'd finally have steady work." The room erupted with laughter again. My parents chuckled as if it were the cleverest suggestion they'd ever heard. And me, I sat frozen, my teacup trembling slightly in my hand. I wanted to shout, to slam the cup down and storm out. But I didn't. I swallowed the humiliation, let it sink deep into me like a stone. What made it unbearable wasn't just her words, it was the way she doubled down every time, growing bolder in her cruelty. She wasn't afraid of consequences because, in her eyes, there were none. Our parents had made sure of that. They had given her permission to treat me as less, to treat me as entertainment, and with each jab, each laugh at my expense, something inside me began to shift. I found myself retreating inward, holding on tightly to the small pride I had in the life I'd built, even if they couldn't see it. But I also began to simmer. Quietly, invisibly, I was collecting every insult, every betrayal, like drops of water in a bucket. And eventually, I knew that bucket would overflow. Melissa thought she was untouchable. She thought her marriage to wealth made her untouchable. And my parents, blind, biased, and eager to bask in her reflected glory, were only too happy to play along. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that even the strongest facade can crack. And the cracks in Melissa's perfect little world were closer than she realized. It happened at another family dinner, though by then I had learned to brace myself for the usual routine. Melissa would gloat, my parents would beam, and I would sit quietly, trying not to let the sting show. I told myself, just get through it. Smile, keep the peace. But that night, she went further than ever before. We were gathered around the table, the same heavy oak table that had witnessed years of holidays, birthdays, and celebrations. Melissa was in high spirits, her voice carrying as she regaled us with another story about her husband's success. Something about a new deal he had closed, another step that had added a fortune to their already overflowing accounts. My parents listened with awe, practically hanging on her every word. I tried to tune it out, focusing on my plate, on the steady rhythm of cutting food and lifting the fork to my mouth. And then Melissa turned the spotlight on me. You know, she said, her tone deceptively light. It's funny. While my husband is negotiating million-dollar contracts, my dear sister here is still hustling for scraps. Isn't it adorable? She's like a little hobbyist, playing at adulthood. The laughter came instantly sharp and cruel, echoing off the walls of the dining room. My father chuckled, my mother smirked, and Melissa sat back in her chair, her eyes locked on mine, savoring the sting she knew she'd delivered. I felt the familiar flush rise in my cheeks. But this time something inside me snapped. The words I had swallowed for years pressed hard against my chest, begging to be released. I clenched my hands in my lap, my nails digging into my palms as I tried to keep my composure. And then she added the line that broke me. Honestly, maybe you should just ask my husband for a job. At least then you wouldn't be such an embarrassment to the family. The room fell into an awful rhythm. Melissa's smirk, my parents' laughter, my silence. But inside, I was no longer silent. Inside, I felt a cold clarity. It wasn't just her cruelty, it was their agreement, their delight in tearing me down, that made me realize I couldn't go on this way. Every time I allowed their mockery to pass, I was giving them permission to continue. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I would never allow them to humiliate me like that again. I didn't speak up that night. I didn't lash out or defend myself. Instead, I finished my meal in silence, my hands steady, my expression calm. But within me, a decision had been made. The bucket that had been filling drop by drop was finally full, and I was done letting it overflow in silence. That dinner was the final straw. It was the moment I stopped being the quiet victim and started planning. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold yet, but I knew one thing. Justice was coming. After that dinner, I carried the weight of Melissa's words with me like a stone in my chest. But this time, it didn't crush me. It steadied me. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in humiliation. I was focused, waiting, watching. It was a week later when the unexpected happened. I had gone to visit Melissa and her husband at their home. It wasn't my idea. Of course, Melissa had invited our parents over for brunch, and I had been roped in under the guise of family bonding. Truthfully, I dreaded walking into her sprawling house, with its marble floors and sweeping staircase, a constant reminder of her wealth and my supposed inadequacy. The brunch unfolded much like I'd expected. Melissa showing off her latest luxury purchases, my parents gushing, me trying to stay invisible. But as the day wore on, something shifted. Her husband, let's call him Daniel, wasn't the type to speak much during these gatherings. He usually let Melissa take the stage while he remained quietly polite, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. But that afternoon, as Melissa launched into yet another story at my expense, I noticed Daniel's expression. He wasn't smiling. She had been recounting, in vivid detail, how our parents had laughed at her joke about offering me a job. She rattled it like it was her greatest punchline, her voice loud and gleeful as she relished the memory. Everyone else laughed again, but Daniel didn't. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked briefly to me. Later, when the meal was finished and everyone had drifted into the sitting room, Daniel found me alone in the kitchen, rinsing my teacup just to have something to do with my hands. He leaned against the counter, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I need to say something, he began. I don't agree with how they treat you. I froze, the teacup slippery in my hand. No one had ever said that to me before, not once in all these years. I turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his eyes startled me. I started with nothing. He continued, people forget that. I built what I have piece by piece. And when I watch you, I see someone who's doing the same. They don't respect it because they don't understand it, but I do. His words hit me harder than Melissa's insults ever had, but in the best way. For the first time, someone in that house saw me not as a failure, not as an embarrassment, but as someone with grit, someone who had worth beyond the numbers in her bank account. Then he said the thing that changed everything. If you're ever looking for a way forward, I'd like to help. Not because you need saving, you don't, but because I think you've been underestimated for far too long. And I don't like watching good people get torn down. It was like a door had opened in a wall I thought would always trap me. Daniel wasn't just defending me, he was offering me a chance. A lifeline that was mine to decide how to use. That was my weapon. Not a knife, not a scream, not even revenge in the traditional sense. It was the unexpected alliance of someone who saw the truth and was willing to stand beside me. I left their house that day with my head higher than it had been in years. The plan forming in my mind wasn't about tearing Melissa down. It was about building myself up in a way that would make her cruelty look small, petty, and hollow. And when the moment came, I knew Daniel would be there to confirm it, to give weight to my truth in a way my parents could never deny. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving their mockery. I was preparing for the day I would silence it. The next family dinner felt different from the start. I walked into my parents' dining room with my shoulders squared, and my chin lifted just slightly higher than usual. The room hadn't changed: the polished oak table, the crystal glasses, the faint scent of rosemary and garlic wafting from the kitchen, but I had, for the first time in years, I wasn't dreading the evening. I was ready. Melissa arrived fashionably late, of course, her heels clicking across the tile as though announcing her entrance to the world. She swept into the room with Daniel trailing behind her, effortlessly charming, effortlessly smug. My parents lit up at the sight of her, showering her with compliments before she even had a chance to sit down. I waited, patient, calm, almost detached, because I knew what was coming. I didn't need to start the war. Melissa would do that on her own. She always did. Sure enough, by the time dessert was served, she had taken her shot. She leaned back in her chair, a glass of wine in hand, and with that familiar smirk said, "So, how's the little side hustle going? Still pretending it's a real career?" The laughter came right on cue. My father chuckled. My mother smiled, shaking her head as though Melissa were simply too witty for words. It was the same old scene, the same script they had always played out. But this time, I was ready to flip the script. I set my fork down gently and lifted my gaze, meeting Melissa's eyes without flinching. My voice was steady, calm. "Actually, it's going very well. I just signed a major contract bigger than anything I've ever handled before. It's the kind of opportunity that could change everything for me." The room stilled. Just for a moment, my parents exchanged uncertain glances, caught off guard by the confidence in my tone. Melissa laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Oh please, what kind of contract? Selling crafts at the farmer's market?" That was my cue. I didn't have to say a word. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was firm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who didn't often waste words. "Actually, it's with my company. I offered her the contract myself. I've been watching the work she's been doing, and I can tell you it's impressive. More impressive, frankly, than most of the people we hire." Silence. The kind of silence that makes the air feel heavy, charged. Melissa's smirk faltered, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. My parents blinked rapidly, their mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for air. They hadn't expected this. They couldn't have. I sat back, letting Daniel's words hang in the air. For once, I didn't have to defend myself. I didn't have to argue or beg for their respect. The validation they had always withheld from me had come from the one person they respected most, the millionaire son-in-law who, until now, had never contradicted them. It was the perfect moment. Years of insults, years of humiliation, and in one calm, decisive strike, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time at that dinner table, I wasn't the butt of the joke. I was the one holding all the cards. The silence after Daniel spoke stretched on longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. My parents, who were usually so quick with their words, sat frozen in their chairs, eyes flicking between me and Melissa as though they were watching a play, where the script had suddenly gone off track. Melissa was the first to recover. Though not gracefully, she let out a brittle laugh, sharp and strained. "Oh, Daniel, you're just being kind. You don't actually mean." But he cut her off, his tone steady and final. "I mean every word. Your sister's work is excellent, and I stand by my decision. It wasn't charity. It was business. She's earned it." The color drained from Melissa's face. She opened her mouth to argue again, but Daniel's gaze landed on her, firm and unyielding, and she faltered. I had seen Melissa manipulate people all my life, bending situations to her advantage with charm or force. But in that moment, she was powerless. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Her silence was victory enough. My father cleared his throat, a nervous tick he had when things didn't go his way. "Well, I suppose it's good that you're finally doing something worthwhile," he muttered. But the conviction wasn't there. His authority had cracked. My mother gave a weak smile, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort, darting nervously toward Melissa, who sat rigid in her chair. And then came the part I will never forget, the flicker of rage in Melissa's eyes, as she realized what had just happened. Her entire identity in our family rested on being the success story, the golden child. But in a single sentence, Her own husband had shifted that spotlight onto me. She tried one last time to claw it back. Daniel, you don't understand. She's been trying at this for years. It's nothing new. You're wasting your time. But Daniel didn't budge. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an edge of finality that left no room for argument. What I understand is that hard work deserves recognition, and frankly, it's long overdue. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line, her face flushed with frustration. For the first time in my life, she was on the receiving end of dismissal, her words brushed aside, her superiority dismantled. She sat there, stunned and seething, while I remained quiet, calm, and composed. The tables had turned. The power she had wielded so effortlessly for years had slipped from her grasp, and she knew it. And as I watched her struggle to maintain her composure, I realized something profound. She wasn't laughing anymore. None of them were. There are moments in life when the world seems to tilt, when the power shifts so completely that you can almost feel the air crackle around you. That dinner table, once the stage of my humiliation, had transformed into something else entirely. The stage of my vindication. Melissa sat stiffly in her chair, her hands gripping the stem of her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Her perfect smile had vanished, replaced by a tense silence that betrayed just how deeply Daniel's words had cut her. For once, she wasn't the one in control. For once, she was the one shrinking under the weight of someone else's authority. Daniel leaned back in his chair, unhurried, composed. His gaze swept over the table, lingering on Melissa for a moment before turning to my parents. "I've seen the way you dismiss her," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. "It's not only unfair, it's blind. You're so busy glorifying wealth that you've missed the grit and integrity sitting right in front of you." The words landed with the force of a hammer. My parents sat speechless, caught between embarrassment and disbelief. I could see the cracks in their composure, the flicker of shame in my mother's eyes, the way my father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And then came the moment that will stay with me forever. Daniel turned back to me, his expression softening just slightly. "I respect what you've built. You've worked for everything you have. That's worth more than any shortcut, more than any marriage into money. You've earned my respect in a way that most people never will." The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't have to say a word. I didn't have to defend myself or prove anything. The man my parents idolized, the man whose wealth had elevated Melissa in their eyes, had just declared me the one worthy of respect. Melissa's face was pale with fury. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no sound came. For the first time in her life, she was speechless, undone by the one person she could never contradict without consequence, her own husband. It was poetic justice, perfectly fitting. She had spent years mocking me for not measuring up to him, wielding his success like a weapon to humiliate me. And now, that very weapon had turned in her hands. It was Daniel's voice, Daniel's authority, that shattered her illusion of superiority. I sat there quietly, my heart steady, my hands calm in my lap. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply let the weight of the moment settle over the table like a heavy curtain. Because this wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And for the first time, the truth was undeniable. The laughter that had haunted me for so long was gone. In its place was silence, Melissa's silence, my parents' silence, the silence of a reality they could no longer ignore. That was my victory. Not loud, not flashy, but absolute. Asterisk. In the weeks that followed that dinner, the atmosphere in my family shifted in ways I had never imagined possible. The dynamic that had always felt immovable, Melissa as the golden child, my parents as her cheerleaders, and me as the invisible disappointment was suddenly fractured. My parents, once so quick to laugh at my expense, grew strangely quiet around me. The next time I visited, my mother offered a hesitant compliment about my work, her voice careful, as though testing unfamiliar ground. My father avoided the subject altogether, preferring instead to bury himself in small talk about the weather or the news. It wasn't pride they suddenly felt. I knew it was discomfort. The awareness that their mockery had been exposed for what it was. Melissa, on the other hand, could barely look at me. The humiliation of that night lingered in her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She avoided family dinners for a while, making excuses about being too busy, though I suspected the real reason was simpler. She couldn't bear to sit across from me now that the power balance had changed. When she finally did appear at another gathering, her attitude was noticeably different. She didn't make snide remarks. She didn't roll her eyes when I spoke. She kept her words clipped and polite, her usual smugness gone. I could feel the simmering anger beneath her silence, but it didn't matter. The damage to her throne was permanent. As for Daniel, he stayed true to his word. The contract he gave me opened doors I hadn't thought possible. It wasn't just the work itself, it was the confidence it gave me. The validation that years of effort hadn't been wasted. With his support, I found myself stepping into opportunities I once doubted I could handle. Slowly but surely, my small projects grew into something bigger, sturdier, undeniable. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing tall not because I had finally won my parents' approval, but because I had realized I didn't need it. Their laughter, their favoritism, their shallow judgments, they had shaped me. Yes, but they no longer defined me, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Melissa had spent years using her husband's wealth as a weapon against me, sneering that I was nothing in comparison. But in the end, it was that very husband who dismantled her illusions and held up a mirror to her cruelty. Her downfall was woven from her own arrogance, and there was something deeply poetic in that. My life now is quieter, steadier. I've built a career I'm proud of, one rooted in perseverance and independence. My relationship with my parents remains complicated. They try, in their way, to make amends, but I've learned not to hang my self-worth on their approval. The moral of my story: success isn't about glittering wealth or the ability to flaunt it. It isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one who draws the most applause. True success is about resilience, integrity, and the courage to stand tall even when others try to tear you down. And as for Melissa, well, she learned the hardest way of all that arrogance has a way of collapsing under its own weight. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.